family of shows. Available.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day, we're talking about our fourth position group, the tight end position. And I want to make one stipulation before we get into this one. Remember before the season how I said that there would begin to be a vanguard of two opposing schools of the tight end position, the old guard and the new guard, where you would have to decide between whether or not you trust an old guard member to retain their value as a fantasy option, or one of these new guard players as a breakout candidate. Well, this season really didn't necessarily sum that point up that much, because these top four players really are a weird amalgamation. You have some of those new guard guys I was talking about, and you have one of those old guard guys, and you have someone who you would not have expected to see in this top four. So ultimately, this tight end picture became very muddled as the year went on. But ultimately, it was one of the more fun positions to analyze. I'm glad that I got it wrong, because I'm really excited to see the evolution of the tight end position for years to come, not just in this period of time and over the next decade, because of a lot of these new guard players who really look like they're up for it to challenge what this older hierarchy has been doing these past 5 years. So without further ado, let's talk about this very exhilarating tight end position, shall we? Starting off with the one surprise in the tight end rankings this year, a guy who a lot of people did not have on their radars on a team which is not known for its tight end production at all. But how about Jonnu Smith? Jonnu Smith was someone who, for the Miami Dolphins, has really stepped up in terms of the passing game. After, anemic couple of weeks, the Dolphins' passing game did not look like it would have much direction, but then all of a sudden up steps Jonnu Smith and immediately becomes one of the leading receivers of this team over the past couple of weeks. Ultimately, the Dolphins coming up short of the postseason, but Jonnu Smith, a really special player, a hidden gem amongst tight ends this season. 7.8 points per game average, 124.7 total fantasy points this season at the tight end position. Again, a guy who, yes, was a breakout star, but not necessarily in a way that really jumps off the page, but still someone who next year, if the Dolphins are really struggling to develop their passing game outside of, their big weapons, then Jonnu Smith could have another breakthrough year yet again. There's a reason why he's someone who a lot of NFL head coaches had high hopes about coming into this season beforehand. So congratulations to a guy like Jonnu Smith, really altering the perception of the tight end position, really altering my perception of this old guard, new guard, as someone who just broke through without, any sense of warning here, because I could not have envisioned mentioning him in the top four tight ends of any fantasy football season, but here we find him after an incredible second half of the season. Now let's talk about a guy who I really had high hopes for, still got into this top four, but not necessarily in the most appealing of ways. Trey McBride. This was someone who I really loved coming into this season as perhaps the ultimate dark horse in all of fantasy football. A guy who I really thought would be the difference on any given Sunday for you on a week-by-week basis, but ultimately didn't necessarily live up to those gaudy touchdown numbers I put up. In fact, only scored one touchdown this season in that Week 17 matchup against Los Angeles, so that was a huge disappointment. But still, an impressive season nonetheless for this Arizona Cardinals kind of stop-start offense here. When he was on, he was on. When he was off, this entire Cardinals offense was off, because he truly is one of the biggest receiving threats in the entirety of that Arizona Cardinals offense. So when he wasn't clicking, then ultimately this Arizona Cardinals offense fell flat. But ultimately, he was clicking more often than not this season for this Arizona Cardinals attack, to a tune of 8.9 fantasy points, 126.3 overall fantasy points. And the thing about a guy like Trey McBride is that he is going to be someone who, whether or not the Cardinals really mature as a football team, will be seen as someone who truly defines the position in a way that really will appeal to a lot of fantasy football owners who take this thing seriously. Because Trey McBride is not necessarily going to be in the spotlight that often. He's still someone who I feel like gets overshadowed by a lot of players in his position. And the fact that he only had one touchdown all season is not going to help matters in terms of getting his name out there to a wider fan base. But ultimately, for those who are savvy and for those who jumped on the hype train before it even took off, I do believe that Trey McBride is going to eventually pay off in a big way for all those who has invested in him. And he already is. The fact that he got to this talented position with one singular touchdown all year, let's go to show the value he adds to this Arizona Cardinals offense. Yes, you can imagine this Arizona Cardinals offense is going to improve outside of just giving the ball to him. They have weapons like James Conner in the backfield, Marvin Harrison Jr., Michael Wilson, and guys of that ilk. And so, Trey McBride might see a little bit of regression next season. And the reason why he maintains this sensibility as a premier tight end is because of the fact that a lot of people still might not be paying attention to him and may not even realize how good he looks to be for the rest of his NFL career as this young Arizona Cardinals offense starts to grow and develop. So that's why I'm really, really stoked to see how Trey McBride looks in the future, because the sky's the limit for him. Even if this Arizona offense is kind of stuck in this state of stagnancy for the time being, because that just means that heightened targets will come for him. That just means more over-reliance on him will happen. And even though a lot of positions rely on more complementary style of play, the tight end position is just up for grabs, because all of these guys are not going to be your top point getters week in, week out, right? But if a guy like Trey McBride starts to separate himself from the pack as someone who gets a lot of targets, then ultimately, why not pay attention to him now? Because he adds a lot of value to what this tight end position could mean in terms of what I mean by saying old guard, new guard in the future as well. So look for Trey McBride to be still a guy who can maintain this status as a premier tight end, a top fantasy tight end for you for years to come in this Arizona Cardinals offense. And speaking of big targets, let's go to our tight end 2 this season. One of the new guard guys who broke out in a big way. Gonna be the future and face of this position for years to come. How about Brock Bowers? Guy plays like a wide receiver. His intuition at the tight end position is bar none for a rookie nonetheless, playing in an anemic Raiders offense with two quarterbacks who truly aren't the answer there in Las Vegas. But hopefully this year in the draft, they can pick up a guy like Cam Ward and Shadur Sanders, put him in a situation that allows for him to get the ball to a guy like Brock Bowers, and he can pay dividends. Brock Bowers this season set the single season record for receiving yards by a tight end in the rookie season, surpassing the legendary Mike Ditka, had the most targets of any tight end in the rookie season, and a fact I just learned today, had more targets in one season in the NFL alone than Travis Kelce has had in any of his Hall of Fame career-like seasons. That's a huge stat to remember. Travis Kelce has never had as many targets as Brock Bowers, 112 in any singular season of his career, and he's one of the most legendary tight ends of all time. But Brock Bowers is someone who I really think will stand the test of time. And I feel like the Raiders are a team that's going to be steadily improving for years to come. I feel like by picking up, whether it be Cam Ward or Shadur Sanders in this year's draft, will set them right, give them a good foundation for their future. Yes, they're going to need to really bolster this defense as well, kind of complement and balance things out. But ultimately, by getting it right with Brock Bowers in this year's draft, picking the best player available, I do feel they have set the foundation for a very special offense there in Las Vegas. And Brock Bowers, with a total of 8.7 fantasy points per game average, a total of 139.7 overall, really gives you this kind of player who transcends position, whether it be as one of those inline tight ends, whether it be as a blocker, whether it be as a receiving threat in the slot, on the outside. This guy can line up anywhere, and he immediately becomes a true mismatch for opposing defenses. And in the AFC West, a division that's steadily improving, now has 3 teams in the postseason there, you're going to want a guy like Brock Bowers to steadily grow as the years go on. And I feel like the Raiders can get this right. I feel like the Raiders are on the precipice of something that can start to look like the development of a stellar football team. Brock Bowers is one step. Now they just need to continuously take some more steps to get to that point as well. So that's why I feel like this comes as no surprise to me as Brock Bowers breaks into the tight end top 4 ranks for fantasy football as well. Let's talk about the number 1 player. And this number 1 player may kind of surprise a couple people, a member of that old guard hierarchy, but still a guy I really respect as someone who really has made a name for himself at the tight end position in the NFL, George Kittle. This is someone who has had a very interesting career, had his fair share of injuries throughout his career, has had his fair share of criticism, scrutiny throughout his NFL career, but ultimately has risen to every challenge that has come his way. And this season was a challenging season for the San Francisco 49ers. A lot of injuries to overcome, a lot of external noise surrounding this franchise now, but George Kittle has proved he is a paragon of consistency for this team no matter what. Can deliver for you no matter what circumstances are, ultimately cementing himself as a guy who you can't forget about once this old guard ends up retiring. Yes, you're going to remember guys like Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, potentially a little bit more, but George Kittle deserves to be remembered in that same breath as well, because he really has been the premier tight end in my mind in terms of really evolving what this position may become. If it weren't for Brock Bowers already being in this top 4 position rankings at the tight end position, I'll be saying that George Kittle will be the blueprint for Brock Bowers' career. Someone who is going to come under a lot of scrutiny, has had to battle through a lot of tough circumstances throughout his career, but ultimately has been someone who you cannot deny. And I feel like that is the foundation for Brock Bowers. So that's why I'm so glad that these two finished 1-2 this season in fantasy, because when I look at Brock Bowers, I think of a mini George Kittle for many different reasons. 1, because of their physicality. 2, because of their ability to really create a mismatch in the open field. They don't necessarily have the best speed, but they're 2 guys who you want to bring down because they can create so many yards after catch opportunities in their respective offenses. And George Kittle this year, yes, his team did not perform with him as well on the football field, but he still remains someone I have huge respect for because of the blueprint he's laying for this new guard. When I think about Travis Kelce, yeah, I feel like he's off in his own little world. Mark Andrews is an offense where, yes, he can be a difference maker week in, week out, but ultimately it revolves around Lamar and Derrick Henry. When I look at guys like George Kittle and Brock Bowers, I feel like they truly can be the solution when their teams are struggling. And George Kittle proved to be that in spades in this very dire San Francisco 49ers season. 11.1 fantasy points per game average, 155.9 points overall. And yes, this wasn't necessarily the best of years for the tight end position. But the fact that George Kittle, a guy who by hook or by crook has become one of the better tight ends in the National Football League, is deservedly the tight end 1 this season. And kudos to all these tight ends, because the tight end position is so difficult to diagnose in fantasy. And if you get it wrong, yeah, you might not be as mad at yourself as you are if you got wrong, say, the wide receiver or running back positions. But there's still a position that can swing games in your favor week in, week out. And ultimately, I'm really excited and stoked to see how it develops, because there are some guys in here who I was not expecting to see, and maybe these guys will fall out in the future. But ultimately, this top 4 is a microcosm of what this position can become for the NFL and for fantasy football owners everywhere. So let me know what you think about it in the comments below. But coming up next, we conclude our fantasy football season recap with my favorite position of all, the defense and special teams units that shined all year long. Which surprise team sits at the top in those rankings right after this short break?